Welcome to Death Row. Here, once mighty Phantom F-4s await their final sortie. Their mission? To provide target practice for a new generation of fighter pilots. Everything they know about aerial combat was learned the hard way by the crews who flew the Phantom in anger over the skies of Vietnam. It seems ironic that after some 40 years, the Phantom, which did so much to define air combat with missiles, should be used to help today's fighter pilots hone their skills. First impressions were not promising. If fighters are supposed to be sleek, small and agile, the new fighter that thundered along the runway at Lambert Field in St. Louis on the 27th of May 1958 certainly did not fit that description. It was huge, as big as a Second World War bomber, with two engines, upsloping wings, drooping tail, and a truly brutish appearance. In time, it would be nicknamed the Rhino and doubly ugly. The aircraft was the prototype of the McDonnell Douglas Phantom F-4. The project had begun in 1953 and had many setbacks. But now the US Navy was sufficiently interested to order two prototypes. Over the next 23 years, more examples of the Phantom would pour off the production line than any other aircraft since the Second World War. It would see service with the air forces of 12 countries, and some will see service into the next millennium. The Phantom was to become one of the most potent combat aircraft of all time, excelling in all roles it was given, from air-to-air combat to ground attack, reconnaissance, and electronic warfare. She might not have been the prettiest of planes, but few forgot the experience.
It would do almost anything you could ask of it. Carry a tremendous load, bombs, whatever. Go fast when you needed it. Turn like a top when you needed that. Climb like a homesick angel. Dive through the speed of sound faster than you could blink an eye. She was a mean, lovely, beautiful lady.
The first time that you strap into the Phantom, you realise that you are strapping into a serious piece of heavy metal. Since then, I've flown the F-4 Tornado, which seems to be a lot lighter than the Phantom. The Phantom really seems as if it was honed out of a single piece of iron.
I came out of T-29s in nav school and got to Davis Mountain and walked up to the airplane the first time. I mean, it was awesome. And climbed in the back seat, and I didn't know what to expect. I mean, you talk about sort of walking into the lion's den. But I had a great time back there. I learned an awful lot, and a great experience to get her. In fact, after coming out of the F-4 backseat and then going to pilot training and spending a year in the 37 and 38 and going back to the F-4, kind of the same feeling hit me when I walked up to the F-4 for the first time after being away from a year, how big the airplane and massive it was, just brute force.
Even before the Phantom's first flight, there were many who believed that the era of the air superiority fighter had passed. The Cold War had begun, and a new threat had emerged. Soviet bombers capable of flying at high altitude, armed with nuclear bombs. To counter the threat, the United States Air Force began re-equipping with new aircraft with specific missions. For example, the North American F-100 Super Sabre was the world's first fighter capable of sustained supersonic speed. Its mission was to intercept Soviet jet bombers. Then Then there was the Republic F-105 Thunder Chief. Designed as a fighter-bomber, it could fly supersonic at low level and drop nuclear weapons on Eastern European airfields. This would prevent Soviet fighters from taking off to attack American bombers. These and other aircraft would see action not in a battle for global supremacy, but a guerrilla war, Vietnam. A war that America hadn't planned for. And the deeper it got sucked into the conflict, the more apparent it became that it had the wrong type of aircraft. The Navy, however, wanted a long-range interceptor capable of breaking up bomber formations using missiles. The Phantom looked as if it would meet these needs, and soon it went into full production. But it was a complex and innovative design. Its systems were so complex that it was felt that it was too much for a single pilot to cope with. In order to spread the workload, a second seat was added. The second crewman was initially a qualified pilot, but this resulted in conflict, and the idea was rapidly dropped. Instead, the second seat was eventually occupied by weapons and systems officers, WISOs as they became known in the Air Force. The secret of the Phantom's awesome performance lay not in its sleek, aerodynamically efficient airframe, but in the power of its two engines. The General Electric J-79 turbojets were specially developed for the Phantom program and were capable of giving over 17,000 pounds of thrust each. The engines were placed snugly to the side of the fuselage, in between the first fully variable supersonic inlets and nozzle systems ever fitted in a fighter. These engines provided a top speed of Mach 2.17, over 1,400 miles an hour, and a rate of climb of 50,000 feet per minute to a ceiling of over 60,000 feet. The very broad but thin wing folded at the tip for carrier use. Extra lift at low speed was supplied by blowing high-pressure air piped from the engines across the wing. Westinghouse developed a new, powerful look-down, shoot-down radar system that fitted into the nose. This meant that the Phantom was capable of all-weather interception. Despite the size and weight of the aircraft, it had a range of anything up to 800 miles on a combat mission. The Phantom had no guns. Instead, it carried missiles. In the new order, air combat would be conducted beyond the range of the pilot's vision, or BVR. It carried 4 of the new AIM-7 Sparrow air-to-air missiles, which were slung under the fuselage. These were long-range missiles developed by the Navy for shooting down bombers at high altitude. For closer combat, the Phantom could carry up to 4 AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles on wing pylons. It could also carry the air-to-ground bullpup missiles as well as bombs.
The Sparrow missile, of which this bird always carried 4, that was a long-range missile. It was intended in its original concept as a standoff weapon, fleet defense, against bombers coming after the fleet, and it would work fine under those circumstances, but not in an air-to-air, fighter-to-fighter encounter, although I must say I did get a MiG-17 with a Sparrow missile, but it was just a fluke situation, an occurrence. But so we preferred the Sidewinders.
It was not long before the Phantom was creating a formidable reputation for itself, eventually setting the largest number of world records ever achieved by a single aircraft type. Almost every month, a new one was added to the collection. An altitude of over 98,000 feet, which was improved to 100,000 feet, a 500-kilometer closed-circuit record of just over 15 minutes, coast-to-coast across America, and climb-to-height records which no other aircraft could even approach. The first Phantoms to go into operational service were designated F-4Bs, which joined the US Navy in mid-1961. The following year, Phantom squadrons began their first operational cruises, flying from aircraft carriers. Although it had been designed as a fighter, its prodigious strength and power meant that it was soon carrying other ordnance. It was found that it could carry 14,000 pounds of bombs, more than any of the US Navy bombers. The Phantom's strength made it ideal for carrier operations. The steam catapult that fired it into the air created great stress on the airframe. Enormous power was needed to throw a 60,000-pound aircraft off a short carrier deck and give it enough speed to stay airborne. Equally, the thumping it received when it landed on the deck and was caught by the arrestor wire added to the burden. It was therefore amazing that so many Phantoms notched up more than 3,000 hours of arduous operations, many without even a scratch. By 1964, America was reluctantly being drawn into conflict in Southeast Asia in an attempt to stem the spreading tide of communism. On August 5, 1964, Phantoms flew their first combat sorties as part of Operation Pierce Arrow. On April the 9th the following year, the US Navy scored its first kill when a Chinese Air Force MiG-17 was shot down. From October 1966, the Navy began to receive the F-4J, which had a stronger undercarriage and more powerful engines to help cope with the constant stresses of deck landings. It also had an improved radar system, which made it easier to detect and track low-flying aircraft without getting confusing returns from the land and sea. It was this version that would see most of the action in Vietnam as the air war intensified. By the time America had withdrawn from the war, Navy crews had notched up 40 kills, although 71 Phantoms had been lost. The US Marine Corps also flew Phantoms from June 1962. Like the Navy, the Marines flew F-4Bs before replacing them with J versions. Throughout the Vietnam War, the Marines' Phantoms were used to fly ground attack missions in support of ground forces, as well as mounting offensive strikes into North Vietnam. In 1973, the Phantoms of the Marine Corps were the last US aircraft to see active service in Southeast Asia. However, it was the United States Air Force that became the largest user of the Phantom worldwide. Initially, they received 27 F-4Bs on loan from the Navy for training and evaluation. Then, from 1964, Phantom F-4Cs were delivered to a total of 23 fighter wings. Then in 1967, the D version, with improved avionics better suited to the Air Force's needs in Southeast Asia, began to replace the earlier models. By this time, America was deeply embroiled in the war in Vietnam, and the Phantoms were beginning to demonstrate their awesome capabilities in the strike role. But there were some major operational problems to overcome.
We were tasked with carrying weapons on the airplane that had never been carried before. We took an airplane that was originally about a 30,000 pound airplane and loaded it up to 60,000 pounds with weapons. And some of the weapons, having not been flight tested, could literally, and did, blow some of our airplanes right out of the air. We carried cluster bombs, which got caught in the slipstream of the airplane, vortices, came around armed and blew the tail section off our airplanes. So our job would be to figure out why this happened, make a field fix, and save airplanes and lives. In Asia, the humidity was unbelievable. The heat was unbelievable. Where the MiG-17s and the 19s and the 21s would corrode because the ferrous metals, the metals with iron in it, had no protection. Our aircraft, the high-tech aircraft, we had severe avionics, electronics problems. One that manifested itself right after the first Phantoms went over there is what we call melting cannon plugs. Cannon plug is an electrical connector, takes a bundle of wire, joins it to another bundle. And where the wires come into the back of the plug, it's filled with an epoxy, a compound, which is great in normal conditions. It hardens and that's it. Under moisture and heat, they melted. The epoxy throughout the entire airplane ran out of the plugs. The wires would then start shorting, and in effect, your system shut down. You did not have a flyable airplane. This happened to our entire fleet in Asia. We had to go through a modification program to clean the back of the plugs with chemicals, put new compounds in it. So moisture and heat took a terrible toll on the systems.
The radar missiles were a big missile. They weighed 450 pounds. They were mounted on the bottom of the airplane. They took a lot of abuse. Every time you landed, they got jarred. When we were flying and you get into an air-to-air engagement, or even an air-to-ground engagement, they were moved about a lot violently. So they got all the guts, all the electronics got jumbled up all the time. If you didn't tweak them all the time, they didn't work very well. In fact, for a lot of the air-to-ground missions, especially during the 4 years we didn't go into North Vietnam and didn't really have an air-to-air mission, they were ballast. You had to have them on board the airplane for ballast primarily, and whether they worked or not was not a criteria.
The Phantom was the United States Air Force's first two-seater fighter. And once the initial crewing problems had been ironed out, the value of an extra pair of eyes and brain became all too obvious.
Like Ritchie and de Bellevue or Cunningham and Driscoll flew as crews, because you get to understand each other. It doesn't take a whole sentence anymore to say what you want. It's only 2 words and you can describe what you wanted.
But the biggest problem lay thousands of miles away, back in Washington. The politicians had hoped to wage a limited war, to do just enough to bring the North Vietnamese to the negotiating table. The air operation that was supposed to achieve this goal was called Rolling Thunder. During this campaign, which ran throughout the mid-60s, the USAF would bomb targets selected by the White House and then pause for a few weeks to see if the Viet Cong would begin negotiations. The policy was hopelessly flawed because the Americans hadn't taken into account the fact that the North Vietnamese were committed to fighting a lengthy, total war, and so they simply used the respite in the bombing raids to regroup and rebuild. Secondly, the North Vietnamese economy was based on agriculture, so there were not many industrial centres to bomb. What few there were in and around cities which were off limits as far as the US Air Force was concerned. This was just one of numerous restrictions placed on the Air Force in what were known as the rules of engagement, many of which could have been regarded as farcical if they hadn't needlessly cost airmen's lives. They said the mission of the Air Force is to fly and fight. Instead, the pilots had to fight with one hand tied behind their back.
There were so many of those rules that we just had to accept and learn and work around them. Yes, it was frustrating to watch the MiGs take off and know that you were going to be hit within 5 minutes or so. Yes, it was frustrating to see their aircraft parked in revetments and you couldn't do anything about it. It was also frustrating in that you weren't allowed to fly over their bases, or over downtown Hanoi, or over Haiphong, or within 20 miles of the Chinese border, or anything. And these rules kept coming. And of course, I admit sometimes we bent those rules. I mean, not deliberately, not on purpose, but there were times when survival was a little more important than a rule that somebody in Washington had laid on you.
Another problem was the need for positive visual identification of any targets. Missiles were supposed to enable the Phantom to fight beyond visual range, but in order for the crew to actually see the target, they had to fly in too close for the missiles to be any use at all. Secondly, the North Vietnamese were being armed by the Soviets and Chinese, so built up a formidable system of interlocking anti-aircraft sights. Central to their arsenal was the SAM-2 surface-to-air missile. However, the US crews were not allowed to attack the sites in case they harmed the Soviet advisors. What's more, the US Air Force were only allowed to fly in and out of North Vietnam using specific routes. Needless to say, this was where the SAM sites were concentrated. Knowing how to avoid the SAMs became essential knowledge to American aircrew.
Your survival against SAMs depended upon, in the main, of detecting them before they got to you. And the sooner you did in their flight, the better. In other words, with a pilot and a kid in the back, that's 2 pair of eyes. Multiply that by the 4 aircraft in a flight, plus the other flight. You know, you've got 16 eyeballs looking. And you watch for, in the monsoon season, for a royal of steam on the ground, because the ground is damp and wet, and the blast from the booster on the SAMs would roil up the water, the steam. In the summertime, you look for dust. It was the in-between times that were really tough. But if you saw it launch, you could keep its position in your computer up here. But you're still watching for others. If that little speck, as it grows larger and larger and larger, stays still on this quarter panel here, you're it. If it drifts down, or back, or drifts forward, or up, you're not it. But if it's perfectly still, it's on an intercept to you. Now the best way to avoid is to dive right into it and then move to one side or the other. But we couldn't do that because we were a cohesive force loaded with bombs going in to bomb a target. And if we started turning into every SAM that was shot at us, we'd lose all cohesiveness and probably miss the target altogether, or be vulnerable to the ground fire. So it was a matter of exquisite timing. You watch that thing, and I can't describe it to you, but you knew when it was time to steer it. And you steered that surface-to-air missile by moving yourself. We'd go down, and it would start to follow. And then we'd really go down. You'd just slam the stick right into the into the instrument panel here. All the negative G's you could put on it, you go down. And then just at the right moment, you'd scream, pull. And we'd all pull back on the stick as hard as you could. Now the F-4 didn't like this when it was all loaded with bombs. I mean, it would groan and mush and everything, but if you pulled at the right moment, then the SAM could not follow that last maneuver, and he'd go underneath you. It was scary in the extreme, but it was effective. And some days where you dodged 3 or 4. One day, my flight and I, we by count had 24 of them shot at it. Not all close, but many close enough to chase us right down to the ground. So we were ineffective that day as bombers.
The North Vietnamese were also being supplied with one of the most maneuverable air combat fighters ever built, the MiG-17. The MiG was built for dogfighting at close range, and so it was equipped with a very powerful cannon. This, coupled with the ability of the MiG to turn tightly, gave the Phantom pilots a hard time. It was the kind of air war for which the Americans were totally unprepared.
The attitude then in the Air Force where accidents were bad. You didn't want to lose any airplanes. So if you did more advanced training and took more chances, you had more accidents, was the philosophy. So the way to keep from losing airplanes, because then if you were a wing commander and lost an airplane, you got fired. So we didn't do any advanced training so we wouldn't lose any airplanes in training. Well, but we'd lose airplanes in combat. It was dumb. We have the foresight today to look back and say, wow, we were really stupid. Well, back then, though, we didn't.
Although the Phantom had gone to Vietnam in the strike role, it was increasingly having to carry out escort missions. F-105 Thunder Chiefs, thuds to their crews, were taking on the task of ground attack, but were vulnerable to the MiGs, who had plenty of time to scramble and orbit, waiting for the incoming thuds. The objective of the North Vietnamese Air Force was to get the thuds to jettison their bombs, but if Phantoms were present, they would be left alone. By 1966, the NVAF was equipped with the new MiG-21, which could also carry 2 atoll, infrared, or heat-seeking missiles. But under the rules of engagement, the Americans were forbidden from attacking the MiG's bases. A cunning plan was devised in order to get the NVAF up in the air where it could be hurt badly, if not destroyed. It was called Operation Bolo.
They were designed to fool the ground controllers in North Vietnam into thinking that we were a huge force of F-105s coming in, because the MiGs had been bouncing or tapping or attacking the 105s with increased frequency over the past month or so. And I wanted them to think that we were 105s, loaded for air-to-air combat, not drop bombs. And it worked. We flew just as though we were thuds up until a certain point. At that point, it was too late for them. They would have committed themselves. And then we found out that we were ready for them. And they came popping up through the clouds, and the fight was on. And these were MiG-21s. And we had a glorious day. You know, we claimed, I think we claimed 8. We were given credit for 7 positive.
4 days later, the NVAF lost 2 more MiG-21s. The effect was just what the planets had hoped for. The NVAF seemed to drop out of action altogether to reconsider their tactics. If it seemed like a massacre, there was more to it than better equipment. The advantage the MiG had in close combat was largely cancelled out by Soviet training methods, which discouraged individual pilot skill and initiative. Fighter squadrons were supposed to operate within a rigid system in which the ground controllers decided who, what, when, and where to attack. On the other hand, Phantom crews from both the Air Force and the Navy could rely on long-range airborne guidance by aircraft such as the C-121, the military version of the Constellation, before the enemy became visible on the Phantom's radar. But even with all the technology, it was still down to the crew's skill and judgment to actually win the fight.
You could tell at the initial merge for the fight who you had. Not by name, but by experience. If he looked like he, and acted like he knew what he was doing, he was in the initial group that went to Russia for pilot training, and he was probably had lots of time, a fair amount of time, and was pretty good. If he looked like he didn't know what the hell he was doing, and, he was a danger to himself, he probably was. He was not as good as our lieutenants. Our lieutenants were more aggressive than theirs. They had a clue. They knew what to do. It was going to be easy.
However, the Americans learned some hard lessons about aerial combat during the first phase of the war. As the Phantoms resumed their strike role, attacking bridges and jungle trails that were the arteries along which the North Vietnamese supplies flowed, the method and tactics used during the air campaign were revised from top to bottom. The Navy formed a special combat training school at Miramar, California, that would become known as Top Gun. But the most persistent doubt was the Phantom's lack of a gun. In order to appease the would-be gunfighters, an M61A1 cannon was placed in a pod which could be attached to a pylon on the fuselage centerline. It could fire 6,000 rounds per minute and meant that the Phantom could now fight at close quarters with the MiG-17. However, it was not very successful as it was inaccurate and induced drag.
Even more importantly, in my opinion, and since I was a wing commander, my opinion prevailed. I really didn't want my people carrying a gun. Now, we did it rarely, but my reasoning was that very, very few of the pilots I had in the 4 squadrons in the 8th TAC fighter group, fighter wing, were qualified, truly qualified in aerial combat. So they'd be tempted with that gun to get into the kind of turning battle that I described as being not something you wanted to do. Moreover, I didn't want them using a gun to strafe a truck. We'll bomb the damn truck. But I didn't want my guys getting tempted to get right down treetop level with the gun and choose upsides with the truck because they'd run into traps, flak traps. And it's a quick and easy way to get killed.
Early attempts to incorporate an integral gun were also unsuccessful. The shape of the muzzle created a whistle which could be heard on the ground long before the aircraft appeared. The problem was solved by mounting the gun with a longer muzzle housing. This was designated the Phantom F-4E, almost all of which were delivered to the US Air Force from November 1967. The F-4E proved to be every bit as capable as the earlier versions, even claiming 5 MiGs to gunfire alone. Phantoms also proved to be effective with the electronic countermeasures that were needed to combat the threat of SAMs. Known as wild weasels, the aircraft were adapted to carry radar homing and warning systems as well as anti-radiation missiles. Wild weasel missions were particularly dangerous as the crew had to fly around in order to coax the North Vietnamese into firing at them with a SAM. The wild weasel would use the SAM's radar tracking as a means of homing its own missiles, but they could only fire them once the SAM was launched. It was a cat-and-mouse game in which the timing was absolutely critical. In 1974, the F-4Es replaced the Cs and Ds as wild weasels and were designated F-4Gs. These versions would serve the USAF until after Desert Storm, during which they cut a path through the Iraqi defences during the initial attack on the 17th of January 1991. In March 1972, the last major air campaign of the war began. Richard Nixon was now president, and a new policy to the air war in North Vietnam was in place. Operation Linebacker saw many of the restrictions lifted. The North Vietnamese Air Force had to respond. Air combat using missiles had come a long way in a very short space of time. Crews had learned, for example, that infrared or heat-seeking missiles were less accurate if fired in a dive or climbing towards the sun. But better training and a lifting of restrictions meant that crews were free to chase and fight the North Vietnamese, a task much more to the liking of aggressive fighter pilots. This was the era of the ace, an accolade awarded once a crew had 5 or more kills.
This MiG that's coming at us is conning, so it's putting out a contrail. That's how high it was. And it sees them, the MiG sees the AIM-7 coming up at it, and it does a big tight turn to 6 and puts the missile out of range. His wingman, or I say his wingman, another MiG goes by us. We're still slightly supersonic. We get turned around behind him and do a radar lock, a bore sight lock, where I align the radar with the pipper for the pilot, and he locks on. You can see a little switch you can hit. And we wait, let the radar and the missiles time out, and we fire the missile at the MiG. When we got up to where the MiG debris was, there was a guy in a dirty yellow chute already, and the missile was in part. I mean, the MiG was in parts.
You have to have a mind that thinks for air combat. You know, so there are some people are born maybe to be a priest. I mean, you could give them all the skill and all the opportunity and stick them in there, and they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't take advantage of the opportunity, or they wouldn't, okay, I'm going to turn now because the MiG's going to be surprised. And it's hard to describe, but it might be, it's a personality, or just, are you meant to be in fighters? If you are, then you have this cunning. You think right, as a fighter jock should think.
It was skill, cunning. Not fearless to the point of being dangerous, but fearless to the point of knowing that you could control that fear, and knowing what you had to do to get the job done. Being dedicated to the mission, being dedicated to the team, and not being afraid to go wherever the enemy wanted to go. When we flew into Hanoi, we flew into the most heavily defended area of the world. And the first time you went, the fear was awesome. The 40th time you went, it's not a big deal. It almost got to that. I could watch a SAM on the ground fire up at me and know it wasn't mine.
The success of the Phantom in the United States Armed Forces brought it to the attention of many other countries. One of the first air forces to re-equip with the Phantom was the Israeli Air Force. The IAF had created a formidable reputation for itself following its defeat of the numerically superior Egyptian Air Force during the first hours of the Six-Day War in 1967. France had been supplying the Israelis with aircraft, but following the ceasefire, it began to court the oil-rich Arab countries. Soviet Russia was also helping the Egyptians build an aerial defense system using SAMs, radar, and interceptors. In order to maintain the balance in the region, the United States agreed to supply the IAF with Phantoms. Almost immediately, they were thrown into action. Following their recovery after the Six-Day War, the Egyptians began a war of attrition in an attempt to grind the Israeli defences into the ground. Each time, the IAF proved that they were still vastly superior, despite often being outnumbered. Then, in 1973, the Egyptians and Syrians invaded on the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. The attack caught the Israeli defences completely by surprise, and soon her forces were locked in a desperate fight for survival. Once again, the Phantom was up against its old Vietnam adversary, the MiG-21. After days of intense fighting and suffering losses, the Israeli Air Force began to gain the upper hand and were able to begin providing close air support for the ground forces. The Phantoms had proved once again to be a decisive weapon. The Wild Weasel version had been able to neutralize the SAM defenses and the control centers, effectively preventing the Egyptians from providing any coordinated defense for their ground forces. Arab armor was now in retreat. Out in the open desert, they made easy prey for the IAF, who cleared the way for the Israeli ground forces to mount a rapid advance to within 15 miles of the Syrian capital of Damascus, before a ceasefire was called. For the next 10 years, the IAF continued to fly Phantoms until they were gradually replaced by F-15s and F-16s. Just as the Israeli Air Force were beginning to get operational with their Phantoms, the aircraft was about to take its place in the front line in Western Europe. As early as 1964, Britain's Royal Navy agreed to buy 143 F-4Js for carrier-borne operations. But British defence budgets were going through a phase of savage cuts, and the order was subsequently reduced to 50. Redesignated the F-4K, it took another 4 years before the first batch of aircraft were delivered to Yeovilton to begin trials. They were then redesignated again, this time as FG Mark 1s, FG indicating that they were capable in both fighter and ground attack roles. The main difference in the British Phantoms was that the government had insisted on powering them with Rolls-Royce Spey engines. Was that British aircraft carriers were shorter than their American counterparts, and so the Phantom needed more powerful engines to get them off the deck. Paradoxically, the new installation actually resulted in a deterioration in performance due to the need to reshape the airframe. But the Phantom's life in the Royal Navy was to be a short one. The phasing out of large carriers in the late 70s saw an end to Phantom operations in the Navy. The Navy's Phantoms were passed across to the Royal Air Force, who had been operating their FGR-2s since 1969.
We had the need for many roles, and it's obviously a lot cheaper to buy one aircraft that is capable of performing these roles as opposed to many different types. We know at the time that the TSR-2 was really the great British hope, and unfortunately that was scrapped, and we needed something that could perhaps do a similar role in the bombing and low-level arena. But the plus side with the Phantom was that it was a very, very capable fighter at the same time.
Once you saw what the aircraft could do compared to any other aircraft in service, let's say typically the Hunter or the Lightning in the ground attack and air defence roles respectively, that it could carry an awful lot of kit, it could go a long way, and it could do it in style.
At the time, it was the only aircraft in the world that could go on a long-range bombing mission, medium, low-level, whatever it happened to be, without fighter escort. It had the ability, with its air-to-air radar, to carry the radar-guided air-to-air missile, the Sparrow, as well as a couple of sidewinders, as well as a number of 1,000-pound bombs. And whilst on a bombing run, you could quite easily switch to air-to-air mode and shoot anything down that was coming your way. The thing peculiar about the Phantom was that when it came into service, it was the best in the world in each of the 5 roles that it had. In the air-to-air role, it had a radar and radar-guided missiles, which was far above and beyond anything else that was available at the time, certainly with the look-down, shoot-down capability. In the reconnaissance role, it had a fantastic recce pod and was extremely fast and capable at low level. In the bombing role, it was able to carry lots of bombs externally with big tanks on, so it could go a long distance. Nuclear strike speaks for itself. And in the close air support role, it was one of the first aircraft developed to carry sled pods, which was a very, very capable air-to-ground system. But the thing peculiar about the Phantom was that it was the best in the world in each of those 5 roles. The bottom line was, in each of those roles, it kicked ass.
As their US Air Force counterparts had found, the Phantom represented a quantum leap over the aircraft it was replacing, not least of which was the complexity of its systems.
The Phantom increased the workload in the sense it was a very complex aeroplane, had a lot of systems, was a different generation to anything else that I'd flown at the time. But of course you had a navigator in the back to help you out. But that in itself was another issue. You had to learn how to cooperate with the navigator, how to coordinate your actions in order to get the most out of the system. And that was a fundamental change. I'd say that in the F-4 force, and perhaps it's true to say in the Air Force at large, that we've developed crew cooperation almost to an art form, in the sense that if you really get on with the guy in the back seat and you really know what he's talking about and he understands exactly what you're talking about, then you definitely get 2 and 2 making 5. And that's a terrific bonus. The benefits of flying with the same guy all the time, and the benefits of flying within the same formation all the time, not that you would guarantee that on a regular basis, but the more you can do that, then the better performance you'll put in.
Although the Phantom had joined the RAF in the ground attack role, it was also scheduled to replace the Lightning in the air defence role. Like the Lightning, the Phantom had been conceived as a missile-only fighter, with a gun being added later.
The Phantom had the SUU-23 20mm Gatling gun, which was a superb piece of kit. It would basically chainsaw anything apart that got in its way. And it gave us the capability of longer bursts than probably many more modern guns carry, because we had 1,234 rounds of ammunition carried within it, albeit it was less accurate. The disadvantage with it was that it was strapped onto the outside of the aircraft and had to be shimmed up and harmonised every time it was used, because the thing would vibrate and shake. However, I wouldn't start arguing with 1,234 rounds of high explosive, even if it wasn't accurate. Missiles and guns both have their place. Modern air-to-air warfare, realistically, 99% of occasions will end up in a missile kill, and probably 70% of that will be beyond visual range, where a radar missile comes into its own. Certainly a more agile, close-in, heat-seeking missile has its place in the air-to-air combat arena, but the trouble with both of those weapon systems is they can be jammed. You have certain types of electronics that can jam a radar-guided missile, and you have the ability to put flares out and other infrared decoys to jam the close-in range IR-seeking missile. There's one thing you can't jam, however, and that's a bullet.
The Phantom arrived in Europe at the height of the Cold War. As part of its NATO commitment, the RAF maintained its bombers and fighters in graded degrees of readiness, called QRA, or Quick Reaction Alert.
The role of QRA is, and was at the time, air policing. These aircraft were in our airspace without our permission. They hadn't filed flight plans, and generally speaking they would be there either testing our defences to see how long it would take, or intelligence gathering, whether it be eavesdropping or just monitoring our North Sea oil rig installations. The job was to go up and to show them that we would be there at a moment's notice to escort them away, or if things started to get nasty, perhaps in the event of a shooting war, we would be there with a fully armed aircraft to engage them.
An intercept would normally happen on QRA in that the Norwegian air defence system would notice when they were getting these flights around the North Cape. When you looked at it on a map, it was pretty much the equivalent of somebody flying overhead Cyprus in terms of range. So you had a fair bit of notice. It was going to take them 3 or 4 hours before they got down into your area of responsibility. So you'd get a heads up that something was happening. And of course it may well be that it would take so long to come down that you'd change shift and somebody else would get the intercept. And of course the tendency was to try and hang on, to try and get the intercept yourself, to go and get the pictures, because it was quite a thrill when you actually saw these aircraft, the Bears and the Badgers.
I suggest if we're going to make an intercept, we scramble in northern QRA now. Right, thank you.
Northern QRA, this is the button allocator.
Q.
Lucas Alert Mission 56. To vector 020, make flight level 250 for X-ray altitude.
Juliet 060. Make our position Cap 5. To call Buchan, fighter stud 65, backup 29er.
Scramble, 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 acknowledge.
QRA. Hello, Saxa, controller, please. Hello? We've just scrambled for X-ray Alpha Juliet 060. He's vectoring 020 for flight level 250 for Cap 5. Be calling you fighter stud primary 65, backup 29. Affirmative. Okay, and the Shackleton is airborne from Lossie and he's heading up towards you as well. All right, thank you.
At a moment's notice, the hooter would go off and you would be from asleep in your bed to airborne, strapped into 60,000 pounds of killing machine within 10 minutes, and that was the commitment. And on a number of occasions I found myself transiting north, having had a blind panic to get my immersion suit on, run out to the aircraft, up the steps, get the aircraft started, out, airborne safely, only to find we've got a 2-hour transit north to go and look at a bear that's somewhere in between Iceland and Faroes, dropping sonarbars. On the transit north, we'd be speaking to air traffic control agencies, and a little bit nearer the area that we were due to intercept the aircraft, we'd be handed over to a GCI site, which is ground controlled intercept, and they would give us vectors to the target.
The big advantage of the Phantom in the air defence roles was that you had the pulse Doppler radar, which, considering its origins, which were well back in the 60s, gave you a unique capability at that time of a look-down, shoot-down capability if you needed. But certainly you had the only capability, I would say, in the world at that time to pick up low-level targets autonomously.
One of the procedures that we practiced very, very regularly was visual identification, known as a VID. The radar had certain software in it that enabled us with a lock to close to a stabilised position 200 yards behind the aircraft that we were intercepting. Quite handy at night, or if the aircraft was in bad weather, in cloud, in fog, poor visibility. From there, if we did get visual, we would then close up visually to about 200 feet to enable ourselves to normally get the door number if it happened to be a bear, or if it was a totally unidentified aircraft, to actually identify what type it was. Quite difficult at night when it's pitch black, no moon, maybe no ambient lighting. But one of the procedures that we invented to get around that was to pull up alongside, light the afterburner, and the glow from the burners would be sufficient to illuminate the aircraft so we could actually get an ID, and actually more accurate than that, see the door number.
Apart from the defence of Western Europe, the RAF Phantoms were tasked with maintaining a British and NATO presence in many parts of the globe. Flying from Akrotiri in Cyprus, the Phantoms were not only able to train in good weather, but also project a NATO presence in the eastern Mediterranean. Then, following the Falklands War in 1981, Phantoms were sent to the South Atlantic to provide air defence.
1435 flight was famous for the defence of Malta, which is why the nameplate was chosen when they were looking for a small unit to go down and provide air defence cover for the Falkland Islands. Back in the 30s, they had Gloucester Gladiators, and they had 3 of them. It's faith, hope and charity. We had 4 Phantoms as part of 1435 flight in the Falklands, so we had to find a suitable name for the 4th one. So we decided, in keeping with the islands, we'd call it Desperation. So your average sortie in the Falklands would be get airborne as a pair, go off, do some engagements, then go and meet the tanker, go off, do some low flying training, perhaps go back and then do some engagements, practice engagements against the tanker, refuel again, and then go off do a practice diversion to Port Stanley, seeing as that really was our only true diversion from the Falkland Islands. Your average sortie would last somewhere in the region of 2.5 hours, which was quite a nice chunk of the day.
The Phantom remained in RAF service for 25 years. In 1992, the interceptors were retired from service, making way for the Tornado.
The Phantom was retired 11 years before it was due. There were plans in place to upgrade, update the aircraft such that it could be a credible fighter until the year 2003. But it fell victim to the Options for Change program, which was put in place in the early 90s. And instead of the updates which were already in the pipeline, many of the plans of which we'd actually had details of on the squadron, within 18 months or so, the aircraft were on the scrap heap. Very sad.
But Britain was not the only country in Western Europe to fly Phantoms. The West German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, had flown Phantoms since 1973. This was the F-4F, which, although based on the F-4E, was in fact a totally different aeroplane.
In the early 80s, I flew a tour with the German Air Force on the North German coast with fighter wing Richthofen. And the German Phantom at that time was in the, we would call it the day fighter ground attack role. It was day intercept with some limited night capability. But also the German Air Force had a tertiary role of ground attack, and so we spent 1/3 of our time doing conventional ground attack, which I found very interesting. It was a great role to fly in. And the principal difference, I'd say, was that the German Phantom flew a lot better than the RAF Phantom, in the sense it was a much nicer aeroplane to fly because it had the slats on the wing. It didn't have a particularly effective armament at the time. It had an integral gun, which was very accurate, which was something the gun pod never was particularly. But it was only armed with the AIM-9 Sidewinder, and that at the time was a very early model. So by force of circumstance, you had to be, and the guys there were into gunfighting rather than missile fighting. It wasn't BVR, it was getting close with the gun. But they were very, very good at it.
Today, the Luftwaffe still flies Phantoms, having pursued a vigorous upgrade program.
In a close-in combat situation, it's not comparable to modern airplanes anymore. It's not a dogfight airplane anymore. It doesn't turn as well, it doesn't have the weight-to-power ratio. But with all the modifications we made to our F-4s, we're pretty decent in a long-range environment where we can shoot our MRAMs, which we recently purchased, and where we can have our two-man concept, which is a little bit more superior to a single-seater because the two-man, they split their work and the task saturation is not that big. In today's NATO, we have 4 wings actually, with each of them 2 squadrons. One of the wings, however, is a mixed wing with MiG-29 Fulcrums and F-4s. And we have a rapid reaction force and an immediate reaction force. The F-4 will do the long-range work, and the Fulcrum will do the medium and then the short hairs, like the dogfight, because it's a famous dogfight machine.
The Luftwaffe crews carry out their Phantom training in America, where they can take advantage of good weather and wide open spaces.
We do basic training in New Mexico for the guys just graduated from undergraduate navigator and pilot school in Pensacola and Shepherd. We convert them, so to speak, to the F-4 there. And the biggest part we work on right now is the fighter weapons school. We have the F-4 fighter weapons school at Holloman Air Force Base. And we blend in always at the end of the fighter weapons course. After 6 months, we blend in with the U.S. Air Force weapons school at Nellis and do our exercise up there, our graduation exercise.
The Luftwaffe will continue to fly Phantoms into the next century when they will re-equip with the Eurofighter. The Phantom was one of the greatest combat aircraft ever. More than half of the 5,000 built have seen action. Despite its sinister looks, the organ-pipe noises of its engines, and the telltale black smoke trails, it's still regarded with affection by ground crews and pilots in equal measure. Many of those pilots have subsequently moved on from the old Phantom to the latest generation of jet fighters. But they will always remember that they learned their trade in one of the world's greatest combat aircraft of all time. And for the public, the breathtaking displays are still fresh in our memories. Probably the most famous operator of the Phantom was the Blue Angels, the US Navy's aerobatic display team. They needed an aircraft that was instantly responsive for their split-second timing of maneuvers, and they needed a solid platform that would sit perfectly in formation. In the Phantom, like thousands of other pilots, they got everything they wanted.